Anybody have an example they could share, or to have one that they've chosen that they really feel strongly about?
The first one, my daughter and I have both had multiple children come into our care that have been kicked out of other places. One I can think of was a biter. He was kicked out of 2 other daycares for biting, and so we worked with him.
Great.
Found a way to deal with the biting, but not
Great.
get out of here.
Yeah, so a lot of times we put the burden of change on the child, don't we? And really, if the child knew how to change or have those skills, they would do it, right? So it's really, we always have to kind of come back to, it's really our job as adults to figure out what's going on, figure out what we need to do about it, and then help the child have that growth.
I think number 6 really stands out. I think when you're dealing with challenging behaviors, you really just want to figure out what works.
Yeah,
And
right.
sometimes it is something outside of what you're doing either with other children or have done in the past. Just thinking outside of the box sometimes is what will work.
Yeah, really good. And I think that's a really important one because we've all been raised a certain way, we all sat in classrooms a certain way, and so we have a lot of preconceived notions because of that. We also have a lot of pressure from our parents, our grandparents, other people around us, telling us how we should do things. For me, I always want to come back to this one, but we really want to do what works. It's not what my mom thinks I should do. It's not how I was raised. It's not because everybody's telling me I should do this. What really is going to work and be healthy for that child? Anybody else have one they can pick out?
Number 5 sticks out to me for, we always need more information, more thought, but it's sometimes hard when, like, if we have a nonverbal child who can't tell us what it is they're thinking or feeling when they're having certain behaviors or things like that going on, that
Really good.
we can't get that information we need
Good.
of
Yeah.
why they're having a meltdown or
Great.
whatever is going through their brain.
Right. And we always have to deal with things in the moment, right? You guys are in a classroom. You can't just wait until later to deal with it. You have to take care of your structure and deal with it then. The things that keep coming up, yeah, we want to try to figure out more information. We want to try to get with the parents, if they're especially a child that can't talk yet, try to figure out what's going on. And then again, that's where someone in my role might be able to come in as useful to try to do some more investigative work there.
I feel like number 2 too, because sometimes the environment is not the perfect fit for the kid either. Just depending on little noises that could bother kids, just that one stuck out to me the most. It's not just the kid.
Yeah.
It could be its
Great.
environment.
Yeah, the kids are what stick out to us because they're the ones that kind of seem to have the problem sometimes, right? But I think of them as like little barometers, like little thermometers running around. And so when we see this right here, we want to kind of look to the bigger picture. Anybody else have one that they see that they agree with? Anybody see one that they disagree with? Or that they're not sure about?
I think number 4 is kind of tricky because it can be your fault. Maybe your transitions aren't fine-tuned and
Sure.
they're too long, or you don't have enough transitions throughout the day, therefore behaviors ensue because of that. So
Yeah.
I think you gotta really take a look at that
I like
before
it.
you just say, none of it's gonna follow.
Yeah, so really good because I talk a lot in this training about being reflective and coming back to yourself and working on yourself and your growth and the classroom growth. So the reason I put that in there is because sometimes I talk about all of that and then I think people kind of take that to mean like, oh my gosh, I'm doing everything wrong. Or has anybody ever had a child have a meltdown and then you're internally having a meltdown, right?
Yeah.
Especially anybody who has their own kids definitely knows what I'm talking about there, right? So just because we have things that we can do by being reflective doesn't mean that it's your fault that the child's having a meltdown or that things aren't going the way you want them to. Does that make sense? So we kind of have to watch that and not get in that mode of really beating ourselves up and blaming ourselves. What do you guys think about number 3? Does anybody have any thoughts on that one?
sometimes it's hard to remember that they are just children, and even though sometimes it feels like they are personally, like, after you,
Yes.
it's not what's happening. That's just how it's coming out, but
Right.
that's not what actually is happening.
Good. Yeah.
It's hard though.
It is very hard because we tend to think of the world the way we think of it, so we forget that children may be seeing things very differently than us. But that part is very important. I'm going to talk a lot about attachment today, and sometimes you know that attachment is in place because kids will feel like they have a cord directly into your heart and they're just like pulling on it. That's a really good sign that attachment is coming into play, and that's when we do really have to take that step back and realize, yeah, that's coming into play, but it doesn't mean they're doing it to make you mad or to get revenge or anything like that. You are part of the interaction though. All right, so let's talk a little bit about social emotional development. Why do you guys think that's an important thing to talk about? We all know why we have to learn our ABCs and counting and colors and all of these basic things that you guys are teaching children every day, but why is social emotional development so important?
I think that a lot of just facing the haphazard and things really come and goes a child, how you react and how you interact with that child can last forever.
Yeah, don't need it. You
If it can benefit them through things they want to pursue.
That's wonderful, yeah. So that relationship and how you deal with the child can really last forever. I love that.
I worked in a homeless shelter for 2 years, and my job was, I was the resident manager and child activities coordinator, I think was the title. But my job was basically keeping the kids that lived in the shelter busy, so they, stayed out of trouble and stuff. But a couple of side issues to that. One was that a lot of the mothers needed more nurturing than their children did.
Very good, yeah.
They had never had it and couldn't give it. So that was a big part of my job. And the other thing was that a lot of times the braver the parents tried to be, the more the kids acted out the parents' anxiety.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're not just nurturing children, we're nurturing entire families. I'm so glad you brought that up. That's really important. Yeah. Kirk looks like he has something to say.
Always has something
to say.
Why do you think social emotional development is an important piece of what you guys do?
I think it's the most important part of what we do because it sets kids up to learn how to understand their feelings, their emotions, how to, a lot of self-help skills. We use academics in the classroom as props maybe, but really to stimulate social development, emotional development, get them ready to learn simple basic things like sharing and dealing with anger and dealing with frustration and consequences and so forth. So I think kiddos that have good social emotional development are primed to and ready to learn new things.
Very good, yes. So you're really teaching them how to learn because now they're in that mind state where they can have relationships and empathy and self-control and yeah, really good.
I think if you would ask a teacher once they get into school, the biggest thing that they hope a child felt, the child that's getting child care, I'm in agreement with Kirk on that one, that the social emotional development is what moves them forward.
Very
I
good.
think that without that basic, they can't move forward in school. I think that's such a huge piece of what it is to start learning and moving forward as we go.
Yeah, very good. And research really backs up what you're saying. So this book came out, gosh, it's been probably over 20 years ago now, about emotional intelligence and showing that we had thought before this that IQ was really what predicted people's success in life. And I still remember when this book came out, it was all over the news because my mom was a school teacher. First she was an elementary teacher and then she was a math teacher. And so she really, really believed in the power of education. And this shocked her. So this really shocked the educational community that IQ wasn't nearly as important as emotional IQ, which is understanding how to read people and work with people and understand your emotions and have empathy and form relationships. So this really changed the way that people think about things, and I think it's definitely you guys' most important role is to help kids develop this so they can be successful in the future. All right, so name this force. Unable to be broken by word or deed, infants die without it, unencumbered by physical space or distance, so enduring that it can go beyond the grave. You guys can just shout out whatever comes to your mind. Doesn't have to be a right or wrong.
Love.
Love, what? I heard love, but I heard something else.
Affection.
Oh, affection. Did anybody say another word?
Attachment.
Attachment.
Language.
Maternal love or love for mother.
Oh, maternal love, yeah. Anybody else have any other words? Human contact. Great, yeah, so those are all, love is kind of the first one that comes to everybody's mind. The one I was kind of going for is just human connection. There's, like I said, there's no wrong answer. I think love really fits there too. But unable to be broken by word or deed, just the fact that we get angry or we have this feeling of hate even tells us that connection is still there, because we can't have those emotions without that connection. Infants will die without it. They literally will die. Even if you give them food and all of their physical needs, they need that human connection. Unencumbered by physical space or distance, we actually have research now that shows that if you have an intimate connection with someone, so either a parent-child connection or an intimate partner, that you can feel that person's emotions even from 1,000 miles away. So used to that was kind of woo-woo kind of stuff. Now we can actually measure it and know it is actual a real phenomenon that our connections go beyond space.
Like through Snapchat.
Through what? Oh, through Snapchat, absolutely. Yeah.
Is that what we're talking about?
Right, or has anybody ever just kind of had a feeling like, oh my gosh, I think my daughter's in trouble right now? Just that idea of mother's intuition, that emotional connection is so strong we can feel it from a distance. And then going beyond the grave, you could debate about that, but I think a lot of us, when we have a loved one pass on, still would say we feel connected to them. All right, so I'm just going to let you guys read these quotes, just a few quotes about human connection, just to kind of get us focused. Paul Meyer was kind of the original self-help guru. So he's kind of like one of the first people who started the self-help movement about 30 years ago. So I just want you guys to know that when we're talking about a relationship-based approach, that's what we're talking about, is that human connection. And that is something that is far more powerful than any intervention we can do, any consequence or punishment we can give. So that's the kind of force I'm talking about when I'm talking about a relationship-based approach. Basically, so just an introduction to kind of my history with this. I've been teaching about relationship-based approaches for the past 10 years, and I've learned that word relationship is a very loaded word, so that's why I wanted to introduce it with that idea of the human connection. So I have a lot of disclaimers throughout this training to try to make sure everybody's understanding what I'm talking about, because we all have a different perception about relationships, right? It's a very loaded meaning. So basically, my history with this, I started at a residential treatment center called Aspen Ranch. It was a 90-bed treatment center for adolescents, teenagers, and they came and they lived there on site. And that program had what we call a behavioral approach. So it was basically an approach where the kids gained tokens. When they had good behaviors, they moved up on levels based on those tokens and then received certain privileges. And then if they had bad behaviors, they lost those things again. So it was what I would consider a very behaviorally based program. So I got to see kind of the pros and cons of that. I worked down what we called at the barn in that program, so I worked in the equine therapy center, and the kids would come down. Not only did they do therapy, but they learned to ride the horses and work with the horses. And so just naturally working with the animals, we had a much more relationship-based approach because that's how you work with animals. And so we got to see a very different side of these kids in that program. So that was kind of my first experience, just really seeing the contrast between a almost purely behavioral-based approach and a more relationship-based approach. From there, I went to a place called Namakwa Center. It was a program for really little kids that were in the basically a lot of them were in the foster care system, and they were so high needs that they were blowing out of foster homes. And this program used, I can't remember if they called it a relationship-based approach or an attachment-based approach, but basically coming into that program, it was very clear to me they weren't using a behavioral approach. And I had been raised on a system of, you do well, you get rewards, you don't do well, you punish. So that was kind of my perception of working with little kids. So coming into that center, just immediately saw people doing something very different. First time I had a girl kind of blow out of my classroom. I follow her, she's like hiding under the bed and acting out and not doing what she's told. And I'm just thinking, okay, I just have to sit here and wait for her to get done, and then when she gets done, she'll get a punishment, because that was my perception of working with kids at the time. And the house director at the time came in and started interacting with the girl, started going under the bed with her and kind of getting her to play with her and interacting with her in a positive way. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, you don't do that, she's acting out. You can't be friendly with her while she's acting this way. Well, within a few minutes, the girl was listening to her and following directions. They talked about what happened, and back to the classroom they went. And so it's just kind of an example of a relationship-based approach that I learned to use at that center and saw that it was actually very effective with little kids. From there, I went to a place called Hand Up Homes that worked with sexually abusive youth. These were teenagers that had sexual behaviors usually towards younger kids. And these were some of the highest, this is about the highest traumatized population that you can work with. So I found very quickly that working with these teenagers was very similar to working with little kids. And I saw that people in the program were using a relationship-based approach. They just didn't know that they were doing it. They thought they were doing cognitive behavioral therapy. So I went to a class on this and came back very, very excited and said, oh my gosh, you guys are doing this, and we have to teach everyone how to do it, and because you're already doing it, so let's just get really good at it. And it took about a series of about 2 years for us going in circles, talking about this, doing trainings, to really all get on the same page. And it was just a matter of me learning how to communicate it. So hopefully by the time we're in this training, I'll be communicating a lot better. And then also with animal training, I've also, kind of my second life, worked with animals and horses. And it's very interesting to see that even in the animal world, people are moving towards a relationship-based approach now. So used to we trained horses with a lot of gadgets and physical force, bridles, bits, things like that. And the picture kind of demonstrates how people are learning to even work with animals with less force and coercion, just using the relationship. So basically everybody here is already using a relationship-based approach. I just believe if we're already doing something, we should learn what we're doing so we can do it even better. All right, so what it is, based on attachment theory, the foundational idea is that the relationship is the primary motivator and growth factor, kind of goes beyond any reward or punishment that we have. And all intervention and change takes place within the context of a healthy adult-child relationship. So it doesn't mean that we have to stop doing any behavioral things we're doing or stop any interventions. It just means that we understand that they take place in this greater context of a relationship, and that's what we want our foundation to be. What it isn't, again, kind of my disclaimers. So relationship-based doesn't mean being your child's best friend, because sometimes people take a relationship to mean that. It refers to a healthy adult-child relationship. It doesn't refer to being permissive, because healthy relationships naturally contain boundaries, structures, and expectations. And that even goes to our adult relationships, right? So it's definitely going to be true with kids. It doesn't mean only being in a state of gentleness and nurturing. Relationships can include all different emotions and many elements. And while we refer to the relationship as the motivator, we never manipulate through the relationships. We're not using the relationship to get something, we're being aware of the relationship. We want to remain honest and genuine. Growth in the child comes about as a parallel process that will naturally include our own personal growth. You guys have any questions so far? Everybody with me? Okay, so I've got a few pages of just kind of comparison. Again, I'm not saying that every behavioral approach is bad. I'm not saying you have to stop using them. I just want to compare so people understand what I'm talking about. And basically, if we get stuck over on the behavioral side, that's a great time to kind of expand our viewpoint and come into the relationship side. Does that make sense? So sometimes we kind of get stuck over there, and I want us to be able to come from a different approach. So, the behavioral model, just the idea that children operate on cause and effect, rewards and punishment are needed to mold behaviors, and behavior eventually becomes intrinsic with repeated episodes of practice. Does that sound familiar to everyone? Does everybody know what behaviorism is? Somebody who's had a psychology class want to share a little bit about behaviorism? Anybody? Anybody know where it came from? Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, Skinner and Watson.
Yeah, good, yeah.
My father used to do heart with gold stars, and stores, and
Great.
yeah, all kinds of manipulations. He read the wrong psychology.
Yeah, so basically back in the 50s and 60s, came out with the idea of behaviorism, psychologists that were basically studying animals, working with dogs and mice, and saying, hey, everything can be classically conditioned or taught through a series of punishments and rewards. And that heavily influenced both education and parenting at the time. And it still really heavily influences us. So I think it's really important to understand where it came from and that it has been just a very strong impact on how we look at things. So on the relationship side, the idea over here is that the relationship is the most powerful reward. Within a relationship, modeling, approval, disapproval, attention, and physical proximity are powerful reinforcements. And motivation moves to internal through a natural process of increased internal awareness and adult prompts. So we kind of help that process by processing with kids, talking about it. I like these pictures because the one on the left, that's a very behavioral approach. The puppy sits, he gets a treat. The one on the right, this is a very relationship-based approach. So the dog is sitting, now the owner is sitting with it, and they're both laughing and having fun, and that's just a really natural reward that the dog got for sitting. Okay, so on the behavioral side, immediate consequences and rewards are the primary motivation for behavior. Punishment may be necessary if rewards don't work. And consistency is really crucial, as an intermittent reinforcement can create a stronger version of the negative behavior. So if anybody took psychology class, we learned that when we're trying to apply these behavioral principles, if we apply a punishment 3 times, but on the 4th time we apply a reward, what we find is that negative behavior can actually increase. And that's a really important thing to be aware of, especially if you're using a behavioral approach, is that you have to be super consistent. On the relationship-based side, adults help children learn the impact of their behavior, first internally and then through empathy. Emotions are important in relating and relatedness, so emotions don't really come into play on the behavioral side. And then on this side, we have endless opportunities to influence behaviors. Things can naturally unfold in a good way as we engage in a relationship. So you guys know that working with kids, we have infinite chances. If we didn't do it right this time, do you think they're going to do the same thing again? Probably. So I kind of like looking at things that way because we can screw it up time after time after time, and when we get it right, it's going to start changing. So we can just kind of use that as feedback. So we still want to be consistent, but it's not as important. Okay, on the behavioral side, children may be considered bad if they don't conform to the mold. Punishment may increase if it doesn't seem to work, and we may try to mold the child to what we want or expect, so we're really focusing on the behavior that we want. So that's a real danger on the behavioral side, that if the child isn't responding the way that we want, now it's a bad kid or a bad child, and we have to be really careful of that. On the relationship-based side, we always assume the positive potential of all children and work to develop it. If connection isn't established, we work to identify and remove barriers. So there's always hope. So if something isn't going well, we can go back to that connection and work to establish it and find a way forward from there. And then on this side, there's room for self-expression and finding the greatest expression of that child. So it's a little more individualized. Every child's different. They have their own potential that we're working with. All right, on the behavioral side, our esteem of the child is unimportant. It's our consistent application of a system of rewards and consequences. There's no real model to transfer to an approach outside of self. And approval and statements of esteem may be taken as a manipulation. So if we're using those as rewards, kids might not know when we're genuine or not. On the relationship-based side, our esteem of children is actually the primary importance. So how we look at them and what we think of them is actually kind of primary in our relationship. The needs and feelings of others become important by virtue of self-empathy. And we never punish or manipulate through the relationship, but we can express our own genuine feelings. Dismay, disappointment, anger. So we can be a real person, right? And we can share that with kids in a safe way. And then finally, behavioral side, boundaries are set in a neutral way. We set boundaries, but we don't let our emotion come into it. Internal thoughts and models aren't important. The external is what we're really looking at. We wish to control the child, and the process is directed to change the behavior of the child. On the relationship-based side, boundaries and how we set them are important, but emotions may be a part of that process. We must remain aware of our own reactions and responses, both internal and external, as these are important. So our internal feelings and thought process is really important. We focus on controlling ourselves as opposed to controlling the child, because we're responsible for our part of the relationship. And our own self-growth and the modification of the environment are key parts of the process. So, I just want to hear, who here feels that they were raised, their parents parenting, they were raised from a behavioral model of things? Okay, yeah, pretty much anybody like my age or older is definitely going to be raising their hand for that, because again, behaviorism has very, very strongly influenced how we view the world, and we're just now kind of starting to look at things a little bit differently. What do you guys think so far?
On that note, I think if you're a first or second born child, you probably were raised more with a behavioral approach. If you're third child or later, you may, even in the 50s, have been raised in more of a relationship approach.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
Just because parents learn.
Very good. Yeah, so before that that's a really good point. I didn't think about that.
My sister
Yeah.
was so spoiled.
Really good point. That older generation may have had more of a relationship-based model because that psychology hadn't come into play yet. But thanks for bringing that up. Yeah. What do you guys think so far? Any thoughts?
Although I was not raised in the 50s and 60s, I would say I was raised more of the emotional.
Okay. You had more of a relationship side. Yeah.
Just because of my mother, stay-at-home mom, school teacher,
Great.
but
And sometimes
I
parents.
can relate to more of that in my growing up.
That's a really good thing to identify. Yeah. And so it's a little bit more natural way to be, isn't it? Like if we hadn't been taught all this behaviorism, it's probably the relationship-based side is a little more intuitive. It's kind of more how we look at people, right? It's more how we apply things to like adults. Any other thoughts? I'd just like to hear a few thoughts on what you guys think so far with what I'm talking about.
Like for me in my house, my dad was behavioral, my mom was the relationship based. So I feel like for me, I have both of it.
You kind of seen both.
I notice with my own daughter too. So, but yeah, I was raised with both of it from both sides.
Very good. Anybody kind of looking through that list think, oh wow, I really do more of the relationship-based stuff, or I do more of the behavioral-based stuff? What do you guys just think, kind of first thoughts looking through that list in comparison? Yeah.
I think it specifically depends on the child. Like if you have a kid that's doesn't act out a lot, it's kind of rare for them to act out. I would usually use the relationship based. Either way, it's more relationship, but I think that your behavioral targets more kids that need to grasp the understanding of when I do something naughty, there's a consequence. When I do something appropriate, there's a consequence.
So
kind of is just situation based on how you approach.
Great. So you tend to kind of be in that relationship-based mode, but when you're applying an intervention, you've been taught these behavioral interventions, and that's more what you're going to apply. Yeah, great. That's Great way to put it. Yeah, and again, just to be clear, I'm not saying you can't use anything on that behavioral side. I'm just trying to compare and contrast. And personally, I think behaviorism kind of falls short, right? It doesn't really fully explain human behavior. It just explains like the small piece of it. So I think it makes sense to just have a broader viewpoint of
I
things.
think behaviors and more like machines than people.
Yeah.
You expect the machine to work like this and it doesn't always work like that.
Right. Yeah, that's a really good way to put it. All right, so let's move on. We're going to move on to kind of talk about some underlying theories. So we're going to talk about attachment theory. I'd just like to hear a few things. Has anybody heard of attachment theory before? Has everybody heard of attachment? Can somebody just tell me kind of a little bit about what you might know about attachment? What is it? Or what have you heard about it?
I mean, now in the hospitals, they really want the mom to hold the baby against their skin as soon
Great.
as they're born. They don't pull them away from mom
Wonderful.
right away like they used to in
Yeah.
my day. But
So they want that connection to start the
bonding-
second the baby
right,
comes out.
the
Yeah.
bond needs to start right as
Right.
soon as skin contact.
Love that. What else have you guys heard about attachment?
Like, if kids don't get enough attachment, that's when you get kids that are more violent or confused, don't have real, like, social.
Okay, good. Yeah, so if something disrupts that attachment, we
Yes,
can really
the
see that.
therapy thing that you can do until they're like 14 or something, and it can actually kind of turn kids around if they get that bonding and,
Great.
you know.
Yeah. Good. Yeah, and that is true. The attachment is really important. We know that it influences kids physiologically how they are connected with their caregiver. Anything else anybody knows about attachment or that they've heard?
It seems like if they're not attached, that they're more vulnerable for a lot of other problems and sadness and depression in their
Yeah.
lives.
Good.
And they don't have that
Yeah.
connection in
Right.
a loving, good way.
Right. So if they don't have that strong connection with a primary caregiver, yeah, they're prone to a lot of problems.
So we have a charming young man, our care, and he can use it to manipulate.
Okay.
He's very charming.
So attachment goes both ways, doesn't it? Yeah, and that's what I was talking about. Sometimes you just kind of almost feel that cord right into your heart. For me, that's a real signal like, oh, that attachment is coming into play. There, definitely. Good. So attachment, we have all these pictures of babies. So you know it's something that starts from the second a child is born, right? And it has to do with the child and the primary caregiver and how they are bonded. It also has to do with how the primary caregiver responds to that child. So again, back when we were going through all of this psychology, there was a period of time with behaviorism where parents were being told, don't respond to your child, let them cry. You're going to teach them to be needy or spoiled and these sorts of things. What we know now is that's absolutely not true, because what research shows us now is that parents that respond consistently to children and respond consistently to that attachment, the children have what we call a secure attachment, which is they feel very confident, they're able to grow and learn and explore, yet they still come back to that primary caregiver. They look to that person for safety and for feedback on the world. Does that make
Sometimes that attachment's a little unhealthy on the parents' side, though, and you see that with drop-offs where they don't get the reaction from their child that they want, and so they like, oh, they're not crying. What? And they come back for more, and the child's ready to go and do their thing.
Very good. Yeah. So that attachment it's a dynamic, right? It goes both ways. So a lot of times we look at the attachment, we're just looking at the child, but the attachment is always a dynamic. It goes between parents and adults. The definition, a pattern of interaction that develops over time as the infant or toddler and caregiver engage. So it starts out as a baby, but it's a pattern that develops. It's that interaction, and it will develop throughout the lifetime. It comes into play, not only with babies and toddlers, but even with older kids. It's still going, and even in intimate partner relationships. There's a lot of people writing about that now because that's why our intimate partner relationships can contain a lot more emotions and volatility because that attachment is coming into play. So what I want you guys to know about attachment, it's the process through which the infant learns about themselves and the world. So in other words, children obviously aren't born knowing anything about themselves or their world, and the only way they can learn about it is through us. So they're looking at us, they're looking at that primary caregiver and their family, and that's what tells them about themselves, right? That's how they learn who they are and what the world is and what to expect. So if they have a caregiver that's really inconsistent, they're going to start to develop an idea about the world that it might be inconsistent and people might not be trustworthy. Second thing, attachment is natural, innate, and physiological. So this is really important. These are things we can observe on a physiological level, that brain development and body development actually changes in accordance with attachment. So it's not just kind of a wackadoo scientific theory, it's actually something we can see and observe. Does that make sense? Also the fact that it's natural and innate. There's no child without an attachment system. Actually, there's no mammal without an attachment system. So sometimes we get kids that are labeled as attachment disordered. That child still has an attachment system, and that's an important thing to know. The primary caregiver becomes a template through which the child views themselves in the world, so I kind of talked about that. Attachment equals growth, progress, and exploration. Without attachment, there's little growth. Children may become depressed or stuck in a stage of development, and they lose the ability to explore and learn. So if I see a child that's stuck, they're not developing the way they should, they're not learning from their behaviors, I kind of want to go back to this. I want to go back to this human connection because that is what triggers growth. So I want to find out, what's going on with that connection. Again, attachment is an interaction. So both adult and child are involved in that interaction. It's never just the child. Even a lot of times as a therapist, I see kids that have been adopted, and parents want to say, this child is attachment disordered, and that's why we're having all these problems. But if the parents learn to respond appropriately, that's something that can be healed and fixed. So again, it's never just the child. It's always an interaction that we want to work on. And then attachment is a process that continues over the lifetime. Okay, so a couple of things about attachment that I think are important and that have kind of been aha moments for me working with children. So the first thing that was kind of an aha moment for me is this idea that attachment helps children develop empathy. So if we take a baby and a caregiver, typically a mother, but could be anybody that's primary caregiver for the child. Again, in that healthy attachment, the baby cries, the mother responds to that cry, and she tries to figure out why the baby's crying, right? So you kind of go through this process. Is it hungry? Is it cold? Does its tummy hurt? And try to figure out that need. Basically, it's through that process of healthy response that the baby learns to identify eventually its own need. So again, a child isn't born knowing when it's hungry. It just knows that something's uncomfortable and it starts crying. But it's not identifying, oh, I'm hungry. It doesn't know at that point. The mother has to figure that out. And then the child starts to learn its own needs through that process. Basically, the child has to learn self-empathy before true empathy can develop. So a lot of times working with 3 or 4-year-olds, they get in a fight or another child bites another child, and we kind of want to go right to, oh, look, you made this child cry. But the first step that has to happen in empathy is that child has to understand their own feelings. Does that make sense? So as we work with children, we want to keep that in mind, that as we respond to their needs, we help them learn what they're actually needing or lacking, and through that process, they'll start to develop what we consider true empathy, which is where they can understand what someone else is feeling. So does that make sense? Like, you can't understand what someone else is feeling if you don't understand what you're feeling, right? So the primary caregiver's loving, consistent response is the first step in a child learning to identify with feelings and needs. So this was super important for me working with what we consider really troubled children, because almost all of these children had some level of trauma or neglect in their past, and therefore their needs probably hadn't been attended to correctly as little babies. So just an example of this coming into play, this was a teenager that I worked with in residential treatment. A really big kid. He was 17 years old and he was developmentally disabled. And every day, about 30 minutes before dinner time, he would start to escalate. You would see his face would kind of start to turn red. He'd get really tense. He'd start reacting to people in a negative way. And the next thing you know, he is just turning into a big, scary ogre that is being destructive, being intimidating, destroying things, being threatening to staff. And so, of course, everybody's primary concern is that they're feeling intimidated by this child. Because it was consistent and it was occurring, every day right around dinner time, I, tried to help guide everybody and, let's really figure out what's going on with this kid and what he needs. Basically, this child had been neglected as a baby. His needs had not been attended to. He'd been adopted when he was about 1.5 years old. And he did not recognize the signals that he was hungry. So he had no idea he was hungry. He just knew he's feeling irritated and angry. Every little thing is starting to make him feel more that way. And the next thing you know, he's blowing up. Well, just working with the staff so that they can start to recognize this child is hungry, when they would start to see those first signs of him, the red face or the clenched fist or the tightened body, they could start to go up to him and say, hey, we noticed that you're getting tense. Are you feeling okay? Are you feeling uncomfortable? Do you think you might be hungry? And then he could go, oh yeah, I think that I am hungry. And just through this really simple process of considering empathy, we were able to stop these huge blowouts that were happening every day in the milieu and just help this kid be a lot more successful. So again, example of a 17-year-old acting like a 3-year-old, right?
So it says self-empathy must occur before true empathy can develop. How do you teach a child self-empathy?
Yeah, so that's what I'm talking about. How you teach self-empathy. It goes back to that idea of the baby crying and the caregiver responding. So if I see a child who's starting to get escalated, I'm thinking about that baby crying, and I want to try to figure out what is this child's need right now that isn't being met. And if I can come to the child and help them figure out what their need is, maybe what their self-feeling is, then eventually they can start to figure out what their need is. So just like with this teenager, we had to identify the fact that he was hungry and help him learn what it felt like. Oh, this is what it feels like when I'm hungry. So we would respond to that need, and then eventually he could recognize it instead of acting out. So with younger kids, we want to try to meet their needs. And when we see that they're starting to escalate or they're starting to have a negative emotion, you can see it with their body language or their face. We're wanting to attend to them just like we would a younger baby and try to figure out, what's going on? What do you need right now? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Where I'm struggling is you have a child that's not necessarily acting out, just doesn't care.
Yeah.
Care less and not have empathy for somebody else. And
Right.
be perfectly okay with that.
And that's actually perfectly normal for like a 3 or 4-year-old, because 3 and 4-year-olds are basically sociopaths. They have not, it's true, right? If an adult acted like a 3-year-old, we would label them as a sociopath because they have not yet developed that social capacity to really consider how others are feeling. They're only able to consider their own feeling. So the first thing they have to be able to do is understand how they're feeling and care about how they're feeling.
Yeah, because it escalates to everything, not wanting to potty train because we don't care if we wet or pee on the couch or
Right.
all of that snowballs.
Right.
Because we can't figure out that one first piece.
Right, so the first piece is, if we're trying to potty train this child by making them care what we feel, well that's,
Careless.
yeah, they don't, at this point they haven't developed that, so we want to help them care how they feel about it, right? And that's where we want to reach them. Again, if you do have a kid who's just so detached that they don't care about those connections, again, I would go back to that attachment. I would be a little concerned about that. Like, why don't they have that attachment with their caregivers or with you guys? And so how can we work on that? How can we?
Caregiver might be missing.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would approach it from both of those directions, helping the child develop empathy towards him or herself, but also really starting to build that attachment and that relationship and making me a more important person in that child's life through like healthy, positive interactions. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a great question.
I have something to put up on that point. Do you think an I don't care attitude may be a sense of hopelessness? I don't care because nothing I do is going to help anyone.
Absolutely, yeah. So again, it might be a symptom. It could be a symptom of a damaged attachment between the parent and the child, right? Where maybe the parent hasn't really consistently responded to that child, and so they've given up a little bit on that. So again, my consistent response to that child and me becoming a more important person to that child in positive interactions is going to help transfer over when we're in a crisis
I
situation.
kind of saw that with my old son because he had a hearing loss that wasn't identified. I recognized it. The doctor kept telling me it didn't exist.
Yeah.
but he couldn't communicate, and everything he tried to communicate didn't work, so he just kind of quit.
Yeah.
But my other thing is that the second bullet point there, you see parents that their response to everything is to put a bottle in the baby's mouth. You know, if the baby cries, it must be hungry. They don't.
Sure. So they didn't
They don't look for
take the
anything else.
time. Yeah, they didn't
And
take the
then
time to go through
Do you
that
think
process.
that the child learns to identify all feelings of discomfort as hunger, and that's why they may?
Right. So yeah, if it doesn't mean we can't kind of solve that problem just because the baby wasn't treated perfectly. Just like I said, even with this teenager, we were able to go back in and fill that developmental gap by how we approached him. But if we had just applied punishment to that child for how he acted, we never ever would have helped him reach a stage of growth.
I have a good example of that where a child was ordered by his mother to tell me I was stupid. I was teaching kindergarten. The child was ordered by his mother to tell me I was stupid, and he did so. Well, the aide in the classroom immediately jumped on, he has to be punished. And I said, no, the kid's being abused at home, he doesn't need to come here and be abused too.
Right.
If he doesn't do what his mom tells him, he's gonna be punished at home. And if he does do what his mom tells him, he's gonna be punished here. I wonder why this kid is acting out.
Yeah, exactly. So again, if we want to help this child be in a stage of growth, this is where we want to come to first. So yeah, I'm excited that you guys are asking so many questions about this because it is a little different way to look at things. Now, when we get to that 3 or 4-year-old, I did make that comment about 3 or 4-year-olds are basically sociopaths. That doesn't mean we can't start to teach them not to be, right? So what I want to say about that is, first we respond to the child with empathy, so we help them understand their own feeling. But if I do want to start to teach them to have compassion towards others, if I have a strong connection with that child, I might try to do that kind of through my connection with that child. So instead of saying, oh, look, you hurt little Lucy, she's crying, look that she's crying. At that moment, that child might not care. Like, maybe he wanted to make Lucy cry, right? He was angry. So first I want to address it like, oh, wow, that really upset you when Lucy took your toy that you had. But then if I want to start to develop empathy towards Lucy, I might say, wow, I see Lucy's face, she's crying. It makes me feel really sad on the inside. My heart really hurts right now that Lucy is crying like this. And if that child does have that connection with me, they will care about that my heart is hurting and that I'm feeling sad, and they'll start to try to experience that. So that's where that attachment comes into play, that we can start to teach kids empathy with our own responses. Again, we have to use some judgment based on the child's age and what they're ready for, and we're not trying to manipulate them, it's just trying to help them understand.
Would it be helpful if 2 adults modeled like those different types of behaviors in front of a whole group of children?
Yeah, so we can definitely use a social emotional curriculum, especially I think around the age of 4 is when that's really helpful. And we can start teaching kids these skills and start talking about feelings and talking about sharing or talking about what happens when things go wrong and how we can feel sad on the inside or bad on the inside. Again, the more children understand that for themselves, then they can start to apply it to other kids. But if they don't understand to honor and validate their own feeling of being sad, they certainly don't care that Lucy feels sad, right? They have to learn that for themselves first. So to go to the question, how to teach kids empathy, first of all, we want to start with our pyramid. So we always start with safety and physical needs first, right? That's very first. We can't teach any of these emotional skills unless we have a safe environment. So I never want you guys to give up your classroom structure and your teaching structure to teach social emotional skills. You have to start with that basic structure of safety, right? And then making sure the physical needs are met. So you have to start there. Once you're there, then you can move on to using self-empathy. So that means incorporating yourself. So if I've become the most important person in the room because of my interactions with the kids, they are going to care how I feel. So I want to start kind of utilizing that, and I may talk about how I'm feeling. I come in from recess, it might just be a simple thing of like, wow, I'm really cold right now. Are you guys cold? Because I'm like freezing, right? And so that's a great way to just use how you're feeling, and then kids might go, oh yeah, I'm cold, Miss Christie too, but before that they may not have even noticed, right? Or before lunchtime, 10 minutes to lunch, oh my gosh, you guys, I am so hungry right now. Are you guys so excited to eat? Because my stomach is growling, and I'm just, I think my tummy is empty, and I just can't wait to put some food in it. So really simple things.
That depends on the will of the child. I could be shivering,
Yeah.
and my mom would say, April, you should come in, you should put your bike away. And I'm like, no, I'm not. I wanted to be on my bike.
Yeah.
And sometimes it was just,
Oh,
I
sure.
knew I was freezing.
Yeah, you knew you were cold. Yeah.
But I didn't want to go inside.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. But it's just being able to talk about it for ourselves in front of them, because we are the most important person in the room to them. And if we can label how we're feeling, and then they can notice. Yeah, and they might already be noticing, but some kids may not be. So we can use that with really simple things. You can find ways to use it other ways, but again, you're not using it to manipulate. It's just incorporating it into part of the classroom discussion. So once we're talking about our own feelings, we want to start labeling their needs and their feelings. So just like I'm watching you guys' faces, and I see when you might have a comment to make, you guys are watching the kids' faces. Just like you would as a mother, you're noticing like, oh, that child looks a little tired right now, that child looks a little bit hyper, that one just kind of checked out on me. Incorporate that, just like you would if it was your own kid. Like, hey, you look, or even like you would with a friend. Just say you look tired right now, or you look kind of uncomfortable. What's up? Are you feeling okay? And kids will really latch onto this and start talking about these things with you. You can also label body feelings. So, did you? Oh, you know what? We didn't give out the. Did we do the emotion wheel handout? We didn't, did we? But that's okay. But anyway, I had emotional wheel. It's on the next slide. But also, you can also just label body feelings. So just talking about your tummy hurts, your fists are clenched, you're shivering, your arms are crossed. Just noticing these things about their body actually is more effective even than labeling emotions, because it's connected to that base level in their brain. Talking about kids to others in a positive way. So if you guys who have 2 teachers in a classroom, or a teacher and assistant, you guys are so lucky, because that is the most powerful thing you can do. Like you were talking about modeling, and just using that other person to have a conversation with. So you can talk with that other person about how you're feeling in a way that the kids are listening. So you're not talking about like, oh, I feel crappy because my boyfriend dumped me, because that's an adult feeling. But again, just talking with that person of like, hey, I'm hungry right now. Or also talking about the kids, like, hey, I noticed that little Chad, his nose is red, and I wonder if he's not feeling well today. So you can incorporate that discussion. You always want to do it in a positive way, because it is so powerful. It's actually more powerful for the kids to hear you talk about them than it is for you to even talk with them. Again, trying to determine the underlying cause when they are distressed. So just kind of looking at them as that crying baby instead of that destructive 4-year-old, trying to figure out what's going on with them. And then mirroring their emotions or behaviors. So that's the picture of mirroring up there, where the mom is mirroring the child's face. And this one works really great. If you have a kid that's getting ready to go into meltdown, to go up next to them and make that same face, not in a way to make fun of them, but just to kind of mirror back to them what they're feeling. A lot of times it'll really kind of break the tension, but it also helps them tune into what they're feeling. They may not have even noticed they felt that way. So we can use this with both positive and negative emotions, and it just gets us more connected to kids, and it gets them more connected to what's going on with them. And then as we are trying to teach them, we'll verbally connect their actions to results. So we want to start with, hey, I saw you and Susie, taking turns on the swing. That was so cool to see that. Did that feel really good? Or I bet that felt really good when you did that. So it's just labeling their behavior and then labeling the emotion that you think they might have felt with it. So helping them make that connection, like, oh yeah, it did feel really good to have that interaction with Susie. You guys have any questions about this? Does this make sense? So remember to use empathy prior to a consequence, even when the child has done something wrong. A lot of times, child gets in trouble, we're feeling kind of angry with them. We want to try to respond empathetically first, and then problem solve. Now, again, safety is paramount. Safety is first, so your classroom management is first. If you have 5 different kids acting out, that is not a time to respond empathetically. That's a time to get everyone back on track. But within that safe environment, if you have something happen, we want to try to respond empathetically before we redirect that child. So it can be just something as simple as, hey, what's going on here? And then going from there instead of yelling the child's name. Because otherwise we find we're yelling children's names in a negative way a lot through the day, and that's not really teaching them anything. So if we can, we want to try to respond with empathy. Hey, what's going on? I see kids are unhappy over here. I see someone's crying. I see that, children are moving very quickly. Just describe what you're seeing, and then help take it from there. Does that make sense? So, and that's in a case so I use this as an example. So even, little Susie there looks like she's being the aggressor. We still want to respond to her empathetically. So, hey, it looks like you really wanted that bottle, right? I wonder if next time you could try to ask for it first. So now we're teaching her instead of just redirecting her. All right, so again, just going back to feelings, the more emotion words a child knows, the less challenging behaviors they present. Research studies show that early childhood staff are only using about 1 feeling word per hour, so we just want to increase our vocabulary and how often we're using this. Let's see, you can find this online, so you can print this out and just keep it in your classroom. You can relate feelings to yourself, be creative with feeling words. So this has a lot of different emotion words on it. Just kind of challenge yourselves, have a word of the day or something. Just play with it with your teacher that you work with. Again, incorporate those body feelings. So we don't want to just talk about emotions. We can talk about, your fists are clenched, your face is red, things like that. And notice the child expressions and what that's kind of telling you.
So how many feeling words would you say for an hour?
Just I don't know. It's a good thing. I think it would be a good thing to kind of observe and see how can we say, how can I incorporate feelings, 3 or 4 times an hour, just to start to be a little bit more aware of it. Some classrooms will kind of put things around the walls to remind the teachers, like emotions, feelings, and to talk about them. I've noticed a lot of classrooms have kind of social, emotional stuff on the walls, and that obviously the kids can't read, so that's really to prompt you guys to think about it. So yeah, just see how often you can incorporate emotions or feelings. Or again, responding empathetically doesn't even always have to use an emotion word. It's just noticing what that child is feeling and experiencing.
Oh, I noticed a lot of the words on the outer part of the wheel, inside you've got angry, and then
Right.
the words on the outside, betrayed, resentful, disrespected, they kind of go to the source of the anger.
Yeah, so they're kind of in categories, and then it's kind of moving out to getting more complex.
Where do you find this on the internet?
Karen may be printing it out for us. But you can just Google emotion wheel, and it'll come up. Yeah. All right. So do you guys? What do you need? Yeah, Karen's got it. Yay! So you guys can do a little coloring project with this if you want to. I printed out the black and white version. So, do you guys have any more questions about that empathy piece? Because then we're going to move on to this other aspect of the topic that we talk about. Take a break.
I know you have some.
Okay, so the second part of attachment I want to talk about is this idea of the reflective process of learning. So basically, the child is looking at us as a reflection of them. Does that make sense? So we and the environment are reflecting back to the child who they are. And the flip side of this, too, to look at is that the child then begins to reflect us and their environment, right? So when we see the child acting a certain way, I'm going to make an assumption that it's some reflection of an environment they've been in, a person they've been around. So the reflective process kind of goes both ways. Does that make sense? The child is looking at us to learn about themselves and who they are. And then in return, when we look at the child, we tend to see a reflection back to us. So just a quote I really like here, that baby can't exist in a vacuum. So this reflective process is absolutely paramount to the baby's existence, right? This is how they learn who they are. So with that idea in mind, if you notice, the pictures on the left are pretty different than the pictures on the right. So I want to talk about what the kids on the left are learning about themselves versus the kids on the right. So the child on the left side, what are they learning about themselves and the world around them? What do you guys think? You can just kind of shout some stuff out.
On the left?
Yeah, the pictures over here. What would a child experiencing that be learning about themselves and the world around them based on that reflective process?
Life is good, life is fun.
Life is fun, okay.
They're feeling connected. They're feeling connected.
Okay, they're feeling connected. I can be connected to others. Yeah.
Probably safe and
Yeah, I'm
comforted.
safe. I'm safe. Yeah, good. Yeah, I can trust people. I can trust people. I can trust the world. People are trustworthy.
And more than anything, they're feeling loved.
Good. I'm lovable. Very good. Yeah. Great. So not only what they're learning about the world, they're learning about themselves. I'm lovable. I'm trustworthy. I'm safe.
Optimistic, capable.
Yeah, good. I'm capable. Yeah, the world is going to support me, so I can be confident. Very good. And again, I'm taking this to extremes, so I'm not saying that kids can't ever get in trouble or anything like that. But what about the pictures on the right? If this is the primary environment that the child is in, what are they learning about themselves or the world around them? That they're bad? What's that? Oh, same thing, that they're bad? Worthless or useless? Yeah, why try? That they're not important.
Looks tense.
It looks tense. Yeah, so not really trusting, right?
They're not feeling important.
Yeah, not important. What are they learning about other people?
They might be learning that this is how to make people listen to you.
Good, yeah, that's a good one because we tend to think about that worthless, not important, but very good. Yeah, if I want to be in control, I have to act. This is how adults act. This is what I have to do to be in control. Very good.
It's not always true, but sometimes the bully at school is being bullied at home.
Absolutely, yeah. So that we're learning, this is how I get what I want. This is how I get people to listen to me. Yeah, so a little bit of both, right? And again, I'm not saying that kids are so fragile that they can't ever get in trouble. I'm kind of taking this to extremes to make a point, right? But that how the world responds to this child, how people respond to this child is really starting to teach them something about who they are. So this is how they're developing their internal sense of themselves, is by that.
So have you ever come across a child that's incredibly competitive at a very young age? Like everything is a competition. What would drive that?
Well, I mean, do you think maybe their families are competitive? Is, it might
That's
be,
what I'm trying to figure out.
yeah.
No, I think a big part is when sister came. He was 2, and then sister
Sure.
came along, and then I think that has a big part of it. 'Cause
Sure.
parents are really loving and all that kind of stuff, so
Yeah.
I think that it has to play on, always has to one-up somebody. So I think a big part of that is that.
That feeling of this is how I have to get my needs met. And again, certain things are innate. I mean, everybody knows who has kids that you can have the same exact environment for different children. They're going to respond differently. So part of this is, a 2 or 3-year-old, a lot of them naturally are going to be competitive to get their needs met. But yeah, there seems to be some threat to that
Well,
child.
we're
that,
4 going on 5 in February.
yeah.
So, it's that whole,
Yeah, it's that, but again, it sounds like there's that child, for whatever reason, feels some sort of threat that my needs aren't gonna be met, or I have to act this way to get my needs met. Yeah. Alright, so a couple of important things about this. So how the teacher views the child influences how the teacher interacts with the child, which ultimately influences who the child becomes. So starting with our viewpoint of the child, how important that is in the child's learning and growth. And actually they've done studies on this. A study that they did, they took a classroom full of children, they randomly selected 5 kids, completely random. Some of these kids had started kind of at the bottom of the class. And they told the teacher of that year, these 5 kids have an incredibly high IQ. We've given the whole classroom a test, and these 5 kids show the highest potential for learning. They're incredibly intelligent, and so these are, so you need to be aware of this. At the end of the school year, those 5 kids, again, some of them that came from the very bottom of the class, showed by far the highest growth of the other kids in that class, and in fact, the ones that started out on the bottom were now at the top. So just a real strong illustration of how our viewpoint of the child can be so influential. And then research shows that the main predictor of achievement is the child's perception of, does the teacher like me? So that's...
And I think that in our field, I think a lot of it comes from maybe how we perceive the parents as well.
Good, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that can really come into play, can it?
Mom and dad bring them in that, oh,
Yeah.
he's having a bad day, or, that kind of thing. He's gonna have a rough day today. Or that kind of thing. It does
Absolutely.
influence our perception.
Absolutely, yep. So just to keep in mind how strong that reflective process is. So with that in mind, the idea that the child's impression of whether or not we like them, I want to go to, you guys all got a handout, it's got some colored pictures on it. It talks about connection.
Yeah, this one.
Yeah, this one. Yeah, oh yeah, you guys got that, yeah.
I find it.
I guess they're not all color, but this one with the pictures on it. And we'll take a break here in just a minute, you guys, if we can focus up. We're pretty close to on track, so focus up here. We'll stay on track. So with that idea in mind, that the child thinking whether or not you like them, that being so important, let's think about what we can do to kind of show the kids that we like them, right? So 4 elements of connection: eye contact. So again, going back to those facial expressions we talked about, right? So making eye contact, but going beyond that, really noticing like the kids' facial expressions, how they're feeling, just really taking the time to make that eye contact. And also think about with an infant, right? When we're holding a baby, what are we doing? We're looking right at their face. We make the gaga faces at them. We make the big googly eyes, right? And the infant starts mirroring those back. You can do that with your kids, right? You can do that all the way up to adults. I do it with adults all the time, right? I make a certain face with adults, and it will change the mood of the situation. So we definitely want to do that with kids. We want to make that connection, use that eye contact, make the faces with them. I see some centers, like everybody kind of does some version of the welcome song, or I think most centers do. And you can really use this in your welcome song where you're making that visual connection with every kid. So use a version of the song where it's, you're going to take that child's name, or you're going to use and you, and you, and you, and you're taking that moment to really make that connection with the child, and it will make a difference in your whole day if you will do that, because now they're connected to you. Presence, just being present in the moment. This is a lot harder than it seems as an adult, because especially as teachers or directors, you guys have a lot of things going on. You have a lot of things you have to manage. You're already thinking about the next task when we're on this one. So just really forcing yourself to be in that present moment with the kids. A lot of times there's conflict between kids and adults because adults are in task-oriented mode and children are in play-oriented mode. So if we're starting to be in conflict, we might think about how can I get out of task-oriented mode and come into that more play-oriented mode and be present with the kids. Touch, so using touch, it doesn't always have to be touch depending on the child. It could just be proximity, just coming to stand closer, right? So, and you guys know that when you're managing a classroom, you have somebody who's being the problem child, you might just kind of stand close to them while you're talking, but also using it in a positive way, so pulling that child onto your lap when you're doing your circle if they're having trouble, things like that. Very, very powerful. And then playfulness, again, getting into that play mode, playing with kids, getting on their own level. I still remember when I was a little kid, and all I remember about adults was their knees. That's how I identified adults. What shoes they had and their knees. So if you don't take the time to really get on their own level, that's really what they're seeing of you. So just this, I found this sheet after I'd already put this training together, and I had to add it because I love it so much. It comes from Conscious Discipline, and I would put it up in your classroom. Just look at it every day and really think about how you can incorporate these things, and your day will go much smoother. Okay, you guys wanna take a break? Yeah. Wanna take a break? We'll take a break before we hit this.
This is like my 3-hour lecture hall.